Hey guys, welcome back to the second video of today. I know I promised to do market updates on Fridays from now on, but considering that tomorrow is going to be an insane day for me, it's going to be today. So let's go ahead and talk about what's happening in the market, what's happening with diesel prices, capacity, the spot market, ELP violations, and then look at specifics for dry vans, reefers, and flatbeds. And at the end, we'll talk about data versus experience, although some of you already know, at least those who joined the Discord, that my week has left much to be desired. Ready? Let's go. So, number one is what is going on in general in the market, right? So, in terms of volume, week over week, general volume, not just spot market volume, that decreased by almost 1% week over week. Rejection rates decreased by 10.43% week over week and are currently at 5.15%, unfortunately. Now, if we're looking at the spot data, this is comparing 2 weeks ago to last week. Spot market volume from 2 weeks ago to last week increased by almost 6%, and spot rates for all equipment types increased by 1 cent per mile. Doesn't mean that that's what's happening this week, but we'll get into this week in just a moment. All right, let's take a look at the net change in authorities, and what we can see is it went even higher from last week. So the net change is an addition of 267 carriers net, or at least the MC numbers. If you want to know why, take a look at this chart and you will see that the total gained, which is the red line on top, that decreased, right? So there are less carriers that came in or reinstated their authority, but there were less carriers that were lost as well, right? That had either voluntary or involuntary revocations, and that is in the green line. So that explains the net carrier increase. Now, in terms of ELP out of service orders, these are the totals. And as you can see, yeah, the chart is still trending upwards with some outliers here and there. If we take a look at the data without border zone carriers, because border zone carriers are exempt from getting an out of service order, you will see the blue line is the violations. The pink line is the out of service orders. So first of all, you can see that the pink line, the out of service orders, are on an increase. It's quite clear as day. Now, another thing you will see is that with time, ELP violations and ELP out of service orders are almost exactly the same, right? There is no such huge gap there. And if you need a little bit more of a visual of what that means, here is the percentage of ELP violations that result in out of service orders if we remove border zone carriers. Yeah, it's up there. I mean, it's not always 100%, but it is up there. The latest data shows 87.63% of those who got an ELP violation also got an out of service order. So where are these happening, right? Which states are issuing more out of service orders? The darker the state is, the more out of service orders. The states like Washington or New Mexico or New Hampshire, you can see that they're blank. This is because not a single out of service order was issued in those states. California is still at 1. These are the top 10 states which issued the most out of service orders for ELP. Some of them changed from last week. We have Texas, Wyoming, Tennessee, Arkansas, Arizona, Colorado, Missouri, Iowa, Utah, and Oregon. So yeah, Oregon is now on the list. Now, where are the carriers who are getting these out of service orders based? Most of them are in Texas. As you can see, Montana, Alabama, Maine, New Hampshire, those carriers who are based there have not received a single out of service order. But the top 10 who get the most out of service orders are carriers based in Texas, followed by Illinois, California, Florida, Ohio, Colorado, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Oregon, and Georgia. All right, let's take a look at what is going on with diesel prices. So diesel prices week over week saw zero change, right? But they are still 6.2 cents higher than last month, although they're about 5 cents lower than last year. But yeah, diesel, like I often say, leaves much to be desired. If we take a look at this diesel map, we can see that it doesn't change in the sense of the areas, right? The most expensive is the West Coast and the Northeast. But from week to week, if you take a look, the areas in the West Coast, as well as some of the Rockies and the East Coast, have increased in terms of the price at the pump. The IFTA or less IFTA diesel, raw diesel prices, you can see follows the same pattern as the price at the pump, but the most expensive one is, of course, Oregon, about $4.49 per gallon. And the reason is because Oregon has zero IFTA tax. All right, let's take a look at what is happening on the spot market for dry vans, reefers, and flatbeds. Week over week change. Dry vans and reefers both saw a 2-cent increase per mile if we're comparing 2 weeks ago to last week. Flatbeds stayed flat. Now, rate changes year over year. Dry vans saw no change. Reefers are seeing rates that are 2% higher than this time last year, and flatbeds are seeing rates that are 1.4% lower than last year. Volume increased for all three equipment types from 2 weeks ago to last week, as you can see. But year over year, the only equipment that is seeing higher volume is flatbed, whereas reefers and dry vans see lower volume than this time last year. Let's take a look at what the rates look like on a chart. Yeah, something happened with flatbeds for sure. It is getting more and more challenging on that equipment type. Okay, let's take a look at what's happening with those load volumes on the spot market. So this is this week. As you can see, Texas has the most loads for dry vans, 2,369, followed by California, and then some of the East Coast like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia. But if we compare it to last week, so this was last week, this is this week. So I'm going to just do this for a minute, and you're going to see that for the most part, volumes got lighter for dry vans this week. In terms of the load to truck ratio, this is this week and this is last week. So the load to truck ratio actually did get better, which is interesting, which means considering volumes decreased, but load to truck ratios increased, probably capacity also decreased for some reason, at least this week. This week, unlike last week, there is one place which has over 2 loads per truck, and that is North Dakota, 2.06 loads, although I'd be careful there because in North Dakota, I think there are 64 loads for the whole state. So yeah, just be careful. All right, reefer loads. This is today. This is last week. So reefer loads are like in the big places, they saw decreases, but in places like Wisconsin, Virginia, yeah, there were some increases in loads. It's kind of scattered all over the place. In terms of the load to truck ratio, this is right now, this is last week. So I can't say it got worse. It didn't. It got better in some areas. North Dakota definitely got better, but again, be careful. There are not a lot of loads there. We have Nebraska that seems to have gotten better. Arkansas, Wisconsin, those places got a little bit better in terms of the load to truck ratio. All right, finally, last but not least, flatbeds, the bane of my existence this week. This is what the load map looks like right now. Most of the loads come out of Texas or the South, maybe sometimes California, Southern California. This was the load map last week. So if you take a look, most of the areas actually got lighter. California actually got more saturated with loads for flatbeds. Now, load to truck ratios, yeah, this one I couldn't believe when I compared them. So this is what the load to truck ratios look like right now. And as always, it's Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama that have the highest load to truck ratio. However, if you look at last week, it was a little bit different. Now, yeah, Mississippi had something like 15 loads per truck, and now it has close to 8 loads per truck. So that load to truck ratio definitely went down for flatbeds. But there are some areas that experienced an increase in the load to truck ratio, like South Carolina, for example, right? So there are areas that did experience an increase. All right, now in terms of data versus experience, I feel like this week, definitely the map matches our experience. I actually thought that our week was starting off great, and it did, right? I booked a load that was over $4 per mile with Deadhead, and I was like, okay, this is a good way to start the week. But unfortunately, We lost so many days. There was so little volume. It was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. So a lot of days lost, but this is just how the trucking industry is. One week is one way, the next week it's a completely different market, right? And I think this is one of my biggest issues, is that while we can look at these maps and we can see where the areas were good this week, that doesn't mean that the same areas are going to be that good next week. You can start seeing a pattern for sure, but the market changes constantly. But what I'm curious about is how your week went. How was it for dry vans, reefers, especially because I don't have visibility into that market simply because we are an open deck only carrier. I can look at the load board, but when you're looking versus when you're booking, these are two very different things. So question for you, did certain areas get better in terms of negotiations? Did you see any changes in volumes? Was it a tough week? I'm just curious to hear all of your experiences. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining and watching. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your week and weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and keep learning. See you in the next video.